The wind swept across the Mongolian steppes like a memory, carrying with it the scent of horses, wildflowers, and the whispered stories of generations. In this land without walls, where sky and earth met in a horizon that never blinked, a girl was born beneath a waxing moon to a family of aristocratic lineage. Her name was Chabi. She came into the world wrapped not in silk but in felted wool, swaddled in the raw truth of steppe life. Her tribe, a branch of the Kongrad Confederation, had long been esteemed for their wisdom, their skilled diplomacy, and their daughters, who, more than once, became queens and mothers of kings. But Chabi would not be just another consort among many. From the very first moments of her life, the elders whispered that the girl had been touched by the spirits, that when she opened her eyes for the first time, the flames in the hearth rose higher, and a falcon perched outside the yurt let out a long, mournful cry. Superstition perhaps, but in the steppes, signs mattered. And they mattered most to those who understood how fragile greatness could be when set against the whims of wind and war. Chabi's childhood was neither gentle nor idle. She was taught to ride a horse before she could braid her own hair. She learned to hunt foxes with a falcon, to pitch a gur, and to read the language of clouds that foretold approaching storms. But there was more to her than the sinew and discipline of steppe life. At night, when fires dimmed and the world fell quiet, she listened to the stories of her grandmother. Tales of the great Khan, Genghis, who had once united the fractured clans of the Mongols into a storm that swept across the world. Those stories did not just thrill her, they anchored her. She understood that identity was not inherited, it was seized. But Chabi's destiny was shaped not only by blood and birthright. Her family had ties to powerful lamas in the growing Tibetan Buddhist community. From a young age, she was brought into rituals that mixed steppe animism with tantric prayers, exposed to teachings that painted the universe as a wheel turning endlessly through cycles of life and suffering. It was in these teachings that she began to see power not as brute force, but as harmony, an equilibrium between chaos and order, sword and scroll. It was during the summer migration, near the banks of the Onan River, that Chabi first laid eyes on the man who would change the course of her life, and of an empire. His name was Kublai, and at the time he was not yet a great general or a would-be emperor, but a prince brother to the reigning great Khan, monk. He was broad-shouldered and heavy-set, unlike the lithe warriors that filled the camps, but his eyes held the flame of curiosity. He moved with a kind of quiet deliberation that belied the ferocity he would later show on the battlefield. The two did not meet as lovers or betrothed, but as pieces on a board neither of them fully understood. Their union, like so many among the steppe nobility, was arranged. Yet even in its arrangement there was a recognition, two minds, both shaped by the vastness of the land and the tension between tradition and transformation, drawn together not by accident but by trajectory. The marriage was held under an open sky. Priests chanted, livestock was sacrificed, and the stars burned down on them as if taking note. Chabi entered her husband's yurt not as a stranger, but as someone who already understood the weight that would soon be placed on both their shoulders. She was not naive about the challenges that awaited them. The Mongol Empire was a mosaic of loyalties, languages, and ambitions. And within the court of the Khans, power was a river that shifted its course with alarming speed. First, Chabi played the role expected of her. She bore Kublai children. She kept his hearth warm and his secrets safe. But she did not remain in the background. She watched, listened, and learned. She noticed which courtiers bowed too deeply, and which generals spoke too loudly. She studied maps with her husband, and listened to reports from Chinese envoys, Tibetan monks, and Persian merchants. Where other women were silent, she asked questions. Where others offered flattery, she offered insight. It was during the campaigns in northern China, long before Kublai would crown himself emperor, that Chabi's influence began to deepen. She accompanied him on the journey, not at his side in the saddle, but in the mobile palace that followed the army. While the men fought and negotiated, she met with scholars, examined the local customs, and gathered knowledge. Chabi saw clearly that China was not a territory to be subdued by force alone. It was a civilization ancient and stubborn, that required not domination but understanding. This view, revolutionary in its context, was something she quietly impressed upon her husband. Back in the Mongol homeland, her views were not always welcome. The conservative elders scoffed at her interest in Chinese philosophy. They whispered that she was too close to the ways of the conquered. But Chabi was unmoved. She understood that to rule as the great Khan might have once sufficed, but to govern a land like China required something more subtle, more lasting, a vision. And so, year after year, she built that vision from within the invisible corridors of power. She raised her children to speak multiple tongues. She ensured that Chinese advisors were given audience. She forged relationships with Buddhist teachers, especially from Tibet, whom she believed could offer both spiritual authority and political cohesion. And in private, she continued to mold Kublai's understanding of what empire could be, not a wave of conquest, but a web of influence. In the steppes, power often rode on horseback. But Chabi knew that in the cities of the south, it flowed through silk-clad courtiers, in calligraphy on imperial decrees, and in the loyalty of farmers who had never seen a Mongol warrior in their lives. She respected the sword, but she worshipped the scroll. And as the Mongol world leaned ever more toward the south, toward China and its riches, its challenges, its inertia, Chabi became the invisible bridge, connecting steppe thunder to the still river of Chinese civilization. She was not empress yet, not officially. That title would come years later, with victories hard won and battles barely survived. But even in those early years, she was a force. She did not need a crown to rule. She had already begun reshaping the destiny of her people, not with declarations, but with decisions. Quiet ones, strategic ones. When she rode across the plains beside her husband, she saw not just conquest but consequence. When she knelt in the temples of Tibet, she heard not just chants but channels of influence. And when she sat in council meetings as a silent observer, she noted the fault lines of an empire in the making. She was born of the wind and sand. And yet, from the beginning, she was more than a daughter of the steppe. She was the seed of an idea that would one day transform a dynasty, and perhaps, for a moment, bend history to the will of a woman who understood that the greatest empires were not built by steel alone, but by the quiet, deliberate will of those who could see farther than the battlefield. The journey was only beginning. The storm had not yet broken. But in the eyes of Chabi, there was already the shape of what was to come, a world remade not in the image of the past, but in the vision of a future only she could see clearly. And that future would come. The sun rose across the northern plains like an omen, vast and relentless. Beneath its reach, the wheels of empire turned, creaking, heaving, sometimes bleeding, but always moving. And within that motion, a young woman rode in silence, veiled in purpose. Her name was Chabi, now consort to Prince Kublai of the Borjigin dynasty, and her days of quiet observation were giving way to something deeper, agency. She had entered the prince's world with grace and deliberation. In the early months of her marriage, she learned the architecture of his household, the rhythms of courtly routine, the intrigues behind gifts and glances, the measured distance between concubines and generals. Kublai's camp was not yet the imperial court it would one day become, but already it breathed with ambition. She felt it in the way his advisors spoke of taxes and treaties, not cattle and raids. He was not content to be a mere link in the long chain of Genghis Khan's legacy. He wanted something enduring, something that required more than horses and arrows. And Chabi, even then, understood that his aspirations would demand a new kind of rule, and a new kind of ruler beside him. Her role was subtle at first, a suggestion over tea, a question during a hunting rest, a recollection from her father's dealings with Chinese merchants. Slowly, she became more than wife. She became compass. Kublai, whose mind was always sharp but often restless, began to see that his path was not simply forward, it was outward, toward the vast territories of the Song dynasty, the wealth of the south, the cities where jade was carved and dynasties were remembered in stone. Chabi's instincts guided her. When Kublai debated the merits of building administrative offices in conquered Chinese towns, it was Chabi who encouraged him to respect local officials and Confucian scholars. An empire, she once murmured, is not just what you take, it's what you make people believe they belong to. Those words, never inscribed on any tablet or decree, echoed nonetheless through the policies Kublai began to adopt. He formed schools where Mongol children learned Chinese characters. He issued laws translated into the local tongue. And he allowed civil bureaucrats to keep their titles, provided they swore loyalty. These were not common Mongol practices. This was not how his grandfather had ruled. But this was a different war, and Chabi saw it before anyone else did. Still, there was resistance. The old guard, noblemen from the steppes, hardened by decades of conquest, scoffed at the rituals of Chinese governance. They questioned Kublai's motives. They whispered that his consort had filled his ears with the voices of the conquered. But Chabi was not deterred. She had seen the fragility behind the bravado of warriors. She knew that an empire stretched thin by horses would one day need roots, not reins. Her diplomacy extended beyond language and politics. She forged alliances among the women of the court, where influence ran like an underground stream. She offered kindness without weakness, loyalty without subservience. When other consorts sought favor with flattery, Chabi wielded logic, insight, and the quiet weight of inevitability. She became the one Kublai turned to when decisions pressed heavily. Not always in public, but always in confidence. As Kublai's power grew, so too did the complexity of his world. The Mongol Empire, by then the largest contiguous land empire in history, was splintering at its edges. His brother Monk, the Great Khan, ruled from Karakoram, and though they were bound by blood, their visions diverged. Monk, austere and ruthless, ruled as a steppe autocrat, unmoved by the cultures he conquered. Kublai, under Chabi's influence, was different. He saw China not as an enemy to be subdued, but as a civilization to be wielded. Chabi foresaw the coming storm. When Monk summoned his brothers to campaign in the southwest, against the Song strongholds in Sichuan and Yunnan, Chabi knew the unspoken tension was not just about land, but succession. The campaigns would determine not only borders, but heirs. She prepared accordingly. While Kublai gathered troops, Chabi gathered information. She spoke with monks, merchants, spies. She mapped not just the terrain of battle, but the loyalties of the men who would fight it. And when Kublai departed to join Monk's campaign, Chabi remained behind to manage his domain in northern China. It was an extraordinary assignment, one no woman had ever held before. She governed not with decree, but with discretion, meeting scholars in candlelit chambers, resolving disputes among traders, coordinating the flow of grain and silver. In her hands, a network of cities began to function as more than outposts. They became provinces in embryo. It was during this time that her leadership matured. The Mongol tradition had always valued strong women. Genghis Khan's own daughters had ruled territories and advised warriors. But Chabi's power was something different. She ruled not as a warrior, but as a stateswoman, anticipating the needs of civilians, not just soldiers. She didn't need to raise a sword. She only had to point to a new way forward. But power, like the steppes, is a landscape prone to upheaval. News came that Monk was dead. The cause, disease, possibly poison, was uncertain. What was certain was that the empire now teetered. Rival factions rose instantly, loyal to Kublai on one side, and to his younger brother Erik Bok on the other. What had once been a family had now become a battlefield. Kublai returned, war-worn and grieving, but determined. He knew that to seize the mantle of Great Khan, he would need more than soldiers. He would need legitimacy, alliances, vision. And again he turned to Chabi. In the private chambers of their yurt, the couple laid out their strategy. Kublai would call a Kurultai, an assembly of nobles, to declare his claim. Chabi orchestrated the details. Which envoys to bribe, which factions to appease, which spiritual leaders to endorse them. She leaned heavily on her Tibetan contacts, invoking religious authority as a tool of political endorsement. It worked. The Kurultai, held in the Chinese territory, proclaimed Kublai as Great Khan. But back in Mongolia, another Kurultai crowned Erik Bok. The empire now had two claimants, and a war for its soul had begun. Through it all, Chabi remained a steady presence. As soldiers marched and scouts reported, she mediated disputes between commanders. She advised Kublai on when to press forward and when to delay. And when the tide turned, when Erik Bok's supply lines collapsed and his allies deserted him, it was Chabi who reminded Kublai that mercy, sometimes, was the sharpest blade. With Erik Bok defeated and the title of Great Khan secure, Kublai turned to a greater ambition: China itself. Not as a vassal, not as a province, but as the heart of a new dynasty. He would not just rule as a Mongol Khan, he would rule as a Chinese emperor. Chabi did not blink. She had seen this future years ago. The two began to assemble the cultural architecture of legitimacy. Chabi consulted scholars on Chinese dynastic rituals. She learned the symbolism of dragons, the rites of ancestral worship, the structure of civil administration. Together, they chose a new era name, Yuan, to signal the start of something distinct. And Chabi, ever the bridge, helped translate the language of conquest into the grammar of governance. She also began to reshape the court itself. The Mongol habit of tent-based mobility gave way to palatial permanence. Advisors from Central Asia, Persia, and China began to mix in council. Buddhist monks shared space with Confucian scholars. And behind every decree, every policy shift, Chabi's signature was invisible but unmistakable. She had become more than a consort. She was a co-architect of an empire. But empires, like marriages, are built on constant compromise. Kublai, for all his vision, still bore the instincts of the steppe. He doubted bureaucracy. He distrusted sedentary life. And Chabi, patient but firm, had to guide him past his own shadows. It was not easy. There were arguments, silences, long nights. But in the end, he listened because Chabi had always spoken not for herself, but for the future they both claimed to believe in. She had once been the bride of a rising prince. Now, she stood at the edge of the world, watching that prince become the axis of history. Not through brute force alone, but through the balance she had taught him to wield. Their empire was not yet complete. The wars were not yet over. But the shape of their reign had begun to solidify, and at its heart, there pulsed the quiet, commanding will of a woman who had seen the tides long before they came. The mountains of Yunnan rose before them like a challenge written in stone. Rugged, ancient, and unforgiving. To most, they were a physical barrier. To Kublai and Chabi, they were something more profound, a test of conviction, a crucible of ambition. Beneath those peaks, the first real crucible of their empire would be forged. Not in the splendor of palaces, but in the smoke of war and the decisions that would echo far beyond the battlefield. Kublai's campaign into southwestern China had begun as a directive from his elder brother Monk, the Great Khan, but it quickly became something more personal. The Song dynasty clung stubbornly to its last strongholds in Sichuan and Yunnan, resisting the Mongol advance with desperation sharpened by centuries of imperial tradition. To the Mongol generals, the resistance was an obstacle. To Chabi, it was a mirror. She recognized in the Chinese defenders the same fierce pride that her own ancestors had wielded in the face of foreign conquest. And she knew, instinctively, that raw military power would not be enough to claim this land. Not if they intended to keep it. She traveled with the army, not in armor, not in command, but in presence. While Kublai moved with his war council, she stayed near the center of the mobile palace, observing the pulse of the campaign. The logistics, the morale, the civil consequences. She visited villages that had been overtaken, spoke with captured Chinese officials, and noted how quickly Mongol commanders resorted to destruction when diplomacy would have sufficed. These were not the raids of the past. This was the groundwork for rule. And where her husband was slow to realize the shift, she moved ahead of him, quietly assembling a blueprint for something far more durable than conquest governance. Chabi's days in the mountains were filled with contradiction. In one breath, she offered prayers with Tibetan lamas in hidden shrines. In the next, she negotiated with Han scholars over grain storage and taxation. Her dual identity, as a Mongol noblewoman and a scholar of Chinese and Tibetan systems, allowed her to bridge the impossible. Where the Mongol soldiers saw the Chinese countryside as a battlefield, Chabi saw a civilization with roots too deep to be torn up. If they wished to wear the crown of China, they would have to do more than defeat its armies. They would have to absorb its wisdom. It was during this campaign that Chabi began assembling a council of advisors separate from the military hierarchy, scholars, clerks, monks, and emissaries, whose purpose was not war but continuity. She called upon Confucian thinkers to explain the structure of the local magistrate system. She summoned Persian engineers to advise on irrigation. She encouraged translators to codify not just military orders, but cultural concepts. Under her unseen hand, the groundwork of a multi-ethnic, multilingual administration began to take form. Meanwhile, Kublai pressed forward. Victories came, but they were hard-won, and the terrain was merciless. The jungles of Yuan swallowed soldiers whole. Disease moved faster than arrows. Local resistance fighters harassed supply lines, and the scorching monsoons turned roads to rivers of mud. For every village taken, 3 were lost to attrition or mismanagement. And yet, Kublai would not retreat. Not with Monk watching. Not with Eric Boak waiting in the north. In the tent where strategy turned into orders, Chabi often sat in silence. Her presence a reminder that this war would not end when the last song banner fell. It would end only when the people of these mountains no longer saw their conquerors as outsiders. And so, she nudged policy from behind the curtain. She encouraged Kublai to spare surrendered towns, to respect the customs of captured officials, to appoint local administrators where possible. Each decision, seemingly small, was a brick in the foundation of legitimacy. But legitimacy came at a cost. The old Mongol guard, the grizzled commanders who remembered Genghis and his fury, began to grumble. They resented the leniency, the diplomacy, the deference to books and rituals. They called Chabi the Silken Whisper, a woman who dulled the edge of empire. And in their eyes, she had begun to steer the Khan away from his destiny. Chabi knew the risk. She knew that her influence, though rarely acknowledged, would one day provoke resistance from those who clung to the past. But she also knew that the future belonged not to those who remembered what once was, but to those who imagined what could be. One evening, as rain lashed the tent walls and the scent of incense mingled with sweat and damp wool, Chabi spoke to her husband not of war, but of memory. She told him the story of a Chinese sage who once said that a good ruler was like the North Star, still and constant, while all else moved around him. But, she added, even the North Star must understand the sky it sits in. China is not the same sky as the steppe. If you shine like Genghis here, you may blind them. But if you reflect their light back to them, they will call you heaven-born. Kublai said little in reply. He rarely did when she spoke like that. But the next day, he sent orders to spare a Song village that had resisted only days before. And when his generals protested, he silenced them with a single glance. The campaign wore on. By the time the Mongol forces subdued the region, the cost had been immense. But more than territory had been gained. Kublai had proven that he could lead in China as more than a conqueror. He could govern, and though few would say it aloud, many understood that Chabi had made that possible. Yet even as victory loomed, tragedy struck. Far to the west, news arrived that Monk had died. Suddenly, perhaps poisoned, perhaps sickened by the same brutal campaign that had nearly broken Kublai. With the great Khan dead, the empire stood at a precipice. Every brother, every cousin, every clan with ambition now saw a chance. A war of succession was inevitable. Chabi met the news with the cold clarity of foresight. She had long sensed that the unity forged by Genghis was fragile, a fire barely fed by conquest and kinship. Without Monk, the empire would fracture, unless Kublai could move quickly, decisively, and with moral authority. But authority, she knew, was not inherited. It had to be earned. In the days that followed, as Kublai debated whether to march north and claim his right, Chabi turned her attention to more delicate matters. She sent messages to allies in Karakoram, to spiritual leaders in Tibet, to loyal administrators in the newly conquered territories. She summoned her son, Xinjin, still a child but already aware of the weight his name carried. And she began laying the invisible threads of loyalty and legitimacy that would carry them into the next phase of their lives, not as generals but as rulers. The blood spilled in the mountains was only the beginning. Ahead lay a war not for land, but for the soul of an empire. And Chabi, ever the silken whisper, would guide it, not with shouts or banners, but with the steady, unseen hand of vision. The future had tilted, the wheel had turned, and at its center stood a woman who knew that history was not made only by those who fought, but by those who shaped the meaning of what it meant to win. The messenger arrived at twilight, covered in dust, blood, and silence. His face bore the exhaustion of distance, but his words carried the weight of history. Monk Khan, the great Khan, the eldest son of Talyui, the fourth ruler in the line of Genghis, was dead. For a moment, the world inside Kublai's camp stilled. The air thickened. Soldiers paused mid-march. Advisors looked to the horizon with the nervous gaze of men who had just witnessed the stars shift. But in Chabi's eyes, there was no surprise. Only the sharpening of something she had long prepared for. She had felt it coming. Felt it in the way Monk's letters had grown colder, in the subtle hesitations of his envoys, in the whispers that curled around the edges of the campfire. Power, like the wind on the steppe, never warned before it changed direction. Now the wind had shifted, and the time for whispers was over. Monk's death, in the midst of his southern campaigns, shattered the illusion of imperial permanence. The Mongol Empire, stretched across deserts, rivers, and kingdoms, now stood leaderless, and into that vacuum rushed ambition. Erik Bok, Kublai's youngest brother, had remained in Karakoram, the heart of the old Mongol world. While Kublai governed the vast Chinese territories and commanded armies, Erik had gathered strength among the traditionalists, those who viewed the growing Sinicization of the court with suspicion, who mourned the loss of steppe purity and feared the dilution of Mongol blood by books, rituals, and bureaucracy. The divide was deeper than politics. It was civilizational, and Chabi knew it. As the council convened to discuss the future, she observed from the periphery, her silence more potent than words. Every man in the room knew that Monk's death was not just a loss. It was an invitation. And in the eyes of some, Kublai, with his Chinese advisors and his Chinese policies and his Chinese wife, was no longer truly Mongol. But Chabi was not Chinese, nor was she traditional. She was something new, born of the steppes, tempered by Buddhism, and fluent in the languages of empire. And it was she who urged Kublai to act swiftly, not with swords but with symbols. The empire, she said to him in their private tent, does not belong to the one who shouts the loudest. It belongs to the one whose shadow falls the longest. Kublai heard her, and he moved. A Kurultai would be held, not in Karakoram, the ancestral seat of Mongol power, but in Xanadu, in the newly acquired territories of China. It was a calculated affront to tradition, a declaration that the center of gravity had shifted. And it was a gamble. Chabi managed the preparations with exacting care. She sent invitations to key princes and generals, cloaked in honor but edged with urgency. She arranged for religious leaders to bless the assembly, not only the shamans of the north, but also Tibetan lamas and Chinese monks. She knew that power in the new empire would not be forged through blood alone. It would require divine sanction, cultural legitimacy, and theatrical spectacle. The day of the Kurultai arrived like a thunderclap. Nobles gathered beneath banners that bore the seal of Genghis, even as they looked uneasily at the silks and scrolls that adorned the stage. Kublai, dressed in a fusion of Mongol armor and Chinese brocade, addressed the assembly not only as a brother of the great Khan but as the heir to an evolving vision, an empire that would not merely conquer but endure. He spoke of unity, of destiny, of a future that honored the spirit of the steppe while embracing the order of the south. And behind him, in full view of the assembly, stood Chabi, unveiled, unbowed, undeniable. Her presence was a statement. This was not the old empire. This was something more. Not all came to the Kurultai. Erik Bok in Karakoram convened his own. He declared himself the rightful great Khan and accused Kublai of betrayal. And so, the war began, not with raids or skirmishes, but with declarations and declarations of declarations, echoing across the continent like thunder across the plains. The brothers' war was brutal, though rarely fought face to face. It was a war of messengers and grain routes, of garrisons and allegiances, of propaganda and attrition. Cities changed hands. Generals defected. Supply lines were severed and rezoned. Chabi, never on the battlefield, became one of the war's most decisive strategists. She coordinated correspondence with allies across Central Asia, ensuring that Kublai's claim was echoed in Persian, in Uyghur, in Arabic. She dispatched envoys to the courts of Europe, reinforcing the image of her husband not as a usurper, but as the rightful successor to the lineage of Genghis. And within China, she tightened the bonds of loyalty with local governors, Confucian elites, and Buddhist monastics. She understood better than most that the winner of this war would not be the brother with the most swords, but the one who could weave the most enduring myth. But myth did not feed armies. As the conflict stretched into years, resources dwindled. Erik Bok, dependent on the older trade routes, found himself increasingly isolated. Kublai, drawing on the wealth of China, maintained the upper hand, but only barely. At times, even Chabi feared they would collapse beneath the weight of their own vision. Then came the turning point. A famine struck Karakoram. Herds perished. Supplies thinned. Allies faltered. And with desperation in his eyes, Erik Bok sent envoys not to threaten, but to negotiate. Chabi received the envoys with grace, but no warmth. She had not forgotten the names of the men who had called her foreign, who had sworn that no woman of silk would ever sit beside a true Khan. Now they bowed before her. Erik Bok surrendered. The war was over. Kublai was great Khan not by default but by triumph. Yet even in victory he did not celebrate. The cost had been enormous. The unity of the empire was fractured beyond repair. The other Khanates, in Persia, in Russia, in Central Asia, began to drift away, each forging their own fates. Chabi stood beside her husband on the day of proclamation. She watched as banners rose, as drums thundered, as prayers were chanted in tongues from every corner of the realm. She heard the voices of poets call Kublai the light of the world, the rider between worlds, the heir of heaven and earth. But she knew the truth beneath the titles. This was no longer Genghis's empire. It was theirs, forged in battle, tempered in philosophy, and now crowned by the consent of both blood and vision. The Mongol Empire had entered a new era. One that would be anchored not on the steppes, but in the great cities of China. And Chabi, once a girl from the windswept plains, had become the silent architect of that transformation. She had crossed the mountains of doubt, the valleys of war, and now stood at the threshold of destiny, not only as empress-to-be, but as the mind behind the throne. But ahead lay a greater challenge still, the founding of a dynasty, a house built not only to rule but to last. The weight of empire did not fall all at once. It settled slowly, like snow across a steppe, layer by layer, until the landscape transformed beneath it. When the War of Succession ended and the banners of Erik Bok fell, Kublai Khan stood triumphant as the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. But in the hush that followed victory, there remained a question more profound than any battle cry. What would he become now? The answer, Chabi knew, would not be found in the bloodlines of Genghis Khan or the traditions of the steppes. It would be written in a new language, across a new land, under a different sky. And it would not be Kublai alone who authored it. It would be them, The Middle Kingdom Zhongguo, as the Chinese called it, had long existed not merely as territory, but as a world unto itself. Dynasties had risen and fallen within its walls. Philosophers had etched the nature of heaven into bamboo strips. Emperors had been worshipped not as men, but as the axis between earth and cosmos. For centuries, China had viewed the steppe as wilderness, and its people as barbarians. Now Kublai stood ready to claim that throne. But to do so, he would have to become something the world had never seen. A Mongol Emperor of China. The idea alone stirred unease across the court. The old guard murmured that such a move would dishonor the memory of Genghis. That to sit on a Chinese throne was to abandon the saddle. That no true Khan would wear silk when armor sufficed. But Chabi saw clearly what others could not or would not. She understood that empire was not static. It was fluid, and if Kublai did not shape it, it would shape him. In the winter of 1271, after months of consultation, calculation, and silent maneuvering, Kublai declared the founding of a new dynasty. It would be called Yuan, meaning origin of the universe. The name, chosen with precision, evoked both grandeur and legitimacy. It was not a Mongol name, nor entirely Chinese, it was something in between, something new. Chabi had helped craft it. Behind the formalities of proclamation stood her invisible hand. She had encouraged the use of a Chinese dynastic title to cement Kublai's authority among the Han elite. She had consulted with Confucian scholars to ensure the rituals were precise, the omens favorable, the symbols undeniable. She had drawn from Buddhist cosmology, Persian astrology, and Mongol tradition to align the moment with heaven's will. And then, when the time came, she stood at her husband's side, not as a consort, not as an ornament, but as a co-founder of a dynasty. The Yuan dynasty's birth was not marked by a single ceremony, but by a series of acts that reverberated across the continent. Edicts were issued in multiple languages. Officials were appointed from across ethnic lines: Mongol, Han, Uyghur, Persian. The capital, no longer merely a moving camp, would be built into permanence. It would be called Dadu, the Great Capital. Today it is known as Beijing. Chabi's vision was etched into its very foundation. She oversaw the layout of the new city not from above, but through careful coordination with architects, priests, and scholars. Temples would stand beside administrative halls. Markets would hum beside monasteries. The city was to be a reflection of the empire itself. Layered, diverse, unified by design. And within that design, she created space for faith. Chabi was a devoted Buddhist, not in the ornamental sense, but in practice and philosophy. She had long believed that spiritual harmony could mirror political stability. So she called upon the Tibetan lamas, particularly Fagspa, her longtime spiritual ally, to shape the moral compass of the new regime. Under her patronage, Fagspa developed a new script meant to unify the written language of the empire, one that could be read across cultures and kingdoms. Though the script would never take hold as she hoped, its intention revealed the depth of her ambition, not just to rule, but to reconcile. She also pushed for laws that protected religious diversity. In the Yuan court, Buddhist monks debated Christian priests. Muslim scholars taught alongside Taoist alchemists. To outsiders, it was chaos. To Chabi, it was strength. She knew that empire did not require uniformity. It required tolerance, guided by a firm hand and a clear vision. But tolerance did not mean weakness. She kept a close eye on the nobility, especially those reluctant to accept the trappings of Chinese court life. Some Mongol princes bristled at the protocols of the Forbidden City, the genuflections, the incense, the bureaucratic routines. They saw in them a loss of identity, a betrayal of the wild freedom they had known on the plains. Chabi saw the tension. She did not seek to erase Mongol culture. Instead, she wove it into the fabric of empire. She ensured that Mongol customs were honored on special days, that steppe traditions were preserved in court festivals, that Genghis Khan's legacy was not diminished, but elevated as a founding myth of the Yuan, a myth that now included her. In private, she guided Kublai through the maze of governance. She helped him manage the scholar official class, many of whom were skeptical of a foreign dynasty. She encouraged him to study Chinese philosophy, to host debates, to issue decrees in a voice that resonated beyond conquest. And she watched him grow. Kublai, once restless and unsure, began to settle into his role, not merely as a warlord or a successor, but as a sovereign. He took to statecraft with a discipline born of necessity and a confidence nourished by Chabi's quiet counsel. But with every step forward, there were dangers. Rebellions flared in the south. Song loyalists refused to submit. Droughts and floods tested the regime's resilience. And always, from the shadows, the memory of the old empire lingered. Its divisions, its betrayals, its ghosts. Through it all, Chabi held the center. She advised without demanding. She ruled without reigning. Her influence was not marked by signature or seal, but by the way decisions aligned with wisdom. Ministers who opposed her often found themselves outmaneuvered, not by confrontation, but by consequence. Those who embraced her vision rose swiftly, men of learning, of diplomacy, of faith. And in time, the court changed. The Yuan dynasty began to look less like an occupation and more like a regime. The people, weary of war, began to hope. Farmers sowed again. Temples reopened. Roads that had once been choked with refugees now carried merchants and pilgrims. The empire breathed, cautiously but steadily. It would not last forever. Nothing ever does. But in that fragile, luminous beginning, Chabi's work shone like gold in a riverbed, quiet, embedded, undeniable. She had helped found a dynasty, not by claiming it, but by building it. And in the centuries to come, even as the Yuan faded and the Ming rose, even as history was rewritten and names forgotten, the shape of what she made would remain. An empire not born of a single culture, but of many. Not born of war, but of what came after. And at its birth, there was a woman. Not bowed, not silent, but standing beside the throne she helped create. Before the stones were laid, before the walls climbed from the earth, before the name was spoken by scholars and merchants across Asia, it was only an idea, one whispered between husband and wife beneath a canopy of stars. They stood on the northern plains of what was once an outpost, an expanse where wind crossed the land like a prayer. There, Chabi turned to her husband and said, "If you would rule a kingdom that endures, you must plant its heart in the soil, not only in the saddle." And so Kublai Khan resolved to build Dadu, the great capital. But though his name would appear on the decrees, it was Chabi who would shape the soul of the city. Unlike the temporary camps of the past, Dadu would not be a place for passing seasons. It would be a permanent capital, one that rivaled the glories of Chang'an and Luoyang, yet honored the rhythms of the steppe. It would not only house a government, it would broadcast legitimacy, inspire reverence, and organize the chaos of empire into a center that reflected the order of heaven itself. Chabi began with questions, not about roads or drainage, but about philosophy. She asked monks how the city should breathe with the flow of qi. She consulted astronomers about aligning gates with constellations. She read ancient texts about geomancy, about the placement of imperial halls in relation to mountains and rivers. She did not want a fortress. She wanted a mandala, a spatial embodiment of harmony. The city plan was ambitious beyond anything the Mongols had ever conceived. Grids were laid. Canals traced the borders. Gates were positioned with ritual precision. Markets were arranged to encourage trade not just in goods, but in ideas. And at its center, rising above all else, stood the imperial palace, a compound of authority wrapped in silence and stone. But even palaces need spirit. Chabi walked the construction grounds often, robes tucked beneath her arms, veil fluttering in the wind, her feet treading soil that would soon bear history. She spoke with architects from Persia, artisans from Song China, engineers from the Western Khanates. Each brought their own vision. She listened to all, chose carefully, and blended their talents into a single aesthetic, a capital that bore the marks of 100 lands, yet served a single purpose. Within the palace walls, she redesigned not only space, but protocol. She crafted a court that fused Mongol traditions with Chinese rituals. Bowing was moderated, ceremonial robes adjusted, court music blended. Every gesture became an act of diplomacy. It was not theater, it was education. She wanted Mongol princes to understand the gravitas of empire. She wanted Chinese ministers to recognize their heritage was not discarded, only reborn. In these chambers, Chabi began to shape the imperial household not merely as a domestic sphere, but as a mirror of the empire's diversity. She elevated women from multiple ethnic groups into positions of trust. She oversaw education for palace children, teaching them not just Mongolian and Chinese, but Persian, Tibetan, Uyghur. She brought scribes who could read 10 scripts and guards who had traveled across half the world. But nowhere was her touch felt more profoundly than in her policy of inclusion. She argued for the creation of 4 administrative classes, not simply as a hierarchy of power, but as a way to reflect the mosaic nature of the empire. Mongols held top positions, but the Chinese, the Simu, Central Asians, and the Southern Song population all had roles. It was imperfect. It bred resentment, but it held the empire together like mortar between bricks. Outside the walls, Dadu came alive. Temples rose beside mosques. Markets thrummed with voices in dozens of tongues. In the shadow of the palace, children played with paper kites from the south and bows from the north. The air smelled of sesame oil, lamb, and incense. It was not harmony, but it was coexistence. And that, Chabi knew, was enough for now. She took particular interest in the religious architecture of the city. Under her guidance, Buddhist monasteries flourished. But she also ensured lands were granted for Taoist sanctuaries, for Christian churches brought by Nestorian monks, and for Muslim prayer halls. To each she gave audience. To each she gave respect. In return, she asked only one thing, that they pray not for the rise of one people, but for the peace of all. From time to time, she would retreat to a private garden just north of the main palace. It was not large, but it was quiet, planted with trees brought from every corner of the empire. There was a linden from the west, a ginkgo from the south, a pine from the north. She would walk its paths at dusk, hands clasped, listening not for footsteps, but for silence. It was there that she thought most clearly, and it was there that she faced her greatest anxiety. Legacy. Chabi knew that buildings crumble, laws fade, statues fall, but patterns of thought, those can endure. She did not aim for immortality. She aimed for memory, and she knew that if Dadu functioned as she envisioned, it would shape not only Kublai's reign, but every reign that followed, long after their names were dust. There were threats, of course. Resistance in the south, rebellions in the provinces, discontent among the steppe nobles who still saw Dadu as a betrayal of their Mongol heritage. But Chabi stood firm. She did not argue with them. She simply pointed to the city walls, the flowing markets, the scholars debating in halls. "This," she said quietly to one dissenting general, "is not your loss, it is your future." And in time, even skeptics grew silent. Kublai, for all his strength and vision, had once been a man of motion. But now, in Dadu, he learned stillness. Chabi taught him how to sit through court rituals without impatience, how to weigh a bureaucrat's report with the same seriousness he gave a battle plan. He learned, in short, how to be an emperor in a palace, not just a Khan on a horse. At night, they spoke not of war, but of poems. She read him verses from the Tang dynasty. He told her stories of his childhood on the steppes. They drank fermented mare's milk and Chinese tea in the same sitting. They spoke in Mongolian, but dreamed in many languages. And slowly, without notice, they became not just rulers but founders. Dadu was not perfect. It had poverty, corruption, and fear, but it also had vision. And that vision bore the fingerprints of a woman who believed that empires need not erase what came before, but must build atop it, carefully, wisely, with reverence. Years later, when foreign envoys arrived from Europe and India, they were stunned not just by the wealth of the capital, but by its order. Here, one wrote, is a city of many hearts, but one breath. That breath was hers. Chabi had taken a wilderness of ideas and turned it into a city of meaning. She had taken the chaos of empire and shaped it into form. Not for glory, not for monuments, but for the quiet promise of stability. And as the city walls rose higher, and the palace lanterns glowed deeper into the night, Chabi knew she had done more than build a capital. She had given the empire a center it had never had before, and in doing so she had reshaped the world. Beneath the gilded eaves of Dadu, where incense curled skyward and bells chimed in the wind, a new current stirred, silent, sacred, and powerful. It was not military, nor political. It did not ride on horseback or wear brocade. It moved in the breath of prayer, the murmur of mantras, the delicate brushstroke of a calligrapher copying sutras in a dozen scripts. It was the current of faith, and at its center stood Chabi Khatun. Her spiritual life had always run alongside her political one, not as an escape but as a compass. She was born into a steppe world animated by spirits, shaped by the seasons, and watched over by ancestors. But it was Tibetan Buddhism, with its complex rituals, esoteric teachings, and vision of impermanence and enlightenment, that gave her a framework not just for personal growth, but for empire. She had encountered Tibetan lamas early in life, when caravans brought holy men from the mountains into the Mongol court. While others saw mystics, Chabi saw architects of moral order, men who could offer legitimacy in the eyes of the cosmos, not just men. Among them, one would rise above all others in her esteem: Phagspa. Phagspa was no ordinary monk. A member of the Sakya sect, he was learned, eloquent, and politically astute. At a young age, he had already caught the attention of Kublai. But it was Chabi who saw his full potential, not merely as a spiritual advisor, but as a partner in governance, a bridge between cultures, a figure who could sanctify the Yuan dynasty with more than steel or ink. Under her patronage, Phagspa was elevated to a position no lama had held before: imperial preceptor, spiritual leader not only to Kublai, but to the court itself. It was an unprecedented act, a Tibetan monk guiding a Mongol ruler of a Chinese empire. And yet it worked, because Chabi made it work. She integrated Phagspa's presence into the architecture of court life. His counsel was sought not just in religious matters, but in law, education, diplomacy. She had Buddhist sutras translated into Mongolian, Chinese, and Uyghur. She sponsored the construction of temples that combined Mongol openness with Tibetan symmetry and Chinese elegance. Under her influence, Buddhism became not a private faith, but a public institution. Yet she was careful. Chabi never imposed. Her tolerance remained firm. Muslims, Christians, and Taoists were welcomed at court. Interfaith councils were held, where monks and priests debated cosmology beside ministers discussing taxes. It was messy, at times chaotic, but it was deliberate. She believed that peace was not the absence of difference, but the careful balance of it. Phagspa, encouraged by Chabi, undertook one of the most ambitious linguistic projects of the age: the creation of a universal script. Known today as the Phagspa script, it was designed to bridge the written divide between the many cultures under Yuan rule. It drew inspiration from Tibetan script but was adapted for multiple languages. While it would never replace Chinese characters, its symbolic power was immense. The script embodied Chabi's deepest political philosophy: unity through shared symbols, not forced sameness. She had it carved into official seals, printed on decrees, etched into temple stones. Even foreign envoys marveled at the vision: to rule an empire not merely with law, but with a shared alphabet. The alliance with Phagspa also served another purpose: legitimacy in Tibet. Through religion, Chabi helped bind the Himalayan plateau to the Yuan court, not by occupation but by patronage. In exchange for spiritual authority over Tibet, Phagspa pledged loyalty. It was a rare example of spiritual diplomacy, an empire sanctified not by conquest, but by consent. Back in Dadu, the effect of Chabi's religious policies was profound. Monasteries became centers of learning and relief. Buddhist festivals were observed alongside Mongol rites. Education expanded to include Buddhist ethics. Even court music, once dominated by step drums, now included meditative chants. Her influence filtered into the rhythms of daily life. But Chabi's Buddhism was not only institutional. It was deeply personal. She meditated at dawn, attended pujas with humility, offered alms without ceremony. She saw in Buddhism not escape from empire, but guidance for it. The principles of compassion, detachment, and karmic responsibility shaped her every decision. She urged Kublai to rule with empathy, to see rebellion not just as defiance, but as desperation. Not all accepted her views. Some Mongol nobles whispered that she had become too soft, that she placed monks above warriors. Others accused her of corrupting the Mongol spirit with foreign mysticism. But she never defended herself. She let the temples rise, let the roads stay safe, let the farmers return to their fields. Her results spoke louder than their resentments. Kublai himself, once skeptical of religious pageantry, grew to embrace it. He saw how faith could stabilize the empire, how rituals could bind communities, how monasteries could serve as granaries, schools, hospitals. He listened more closely to Fagspa. He consulted Chabi before major decrees. He softened. In many ways, the Yuan court began to resemble a monastery in motion, its layers of ritual and meditation entwined with law and order. The emperor, once a warrior prince on horseback, now sat on a throne blessed by the lotus, surrounded not just by guards but by scrolls, mantras, and wise counsel. And Chabi, always poised, always just behind the veil, had transformed herself from empress into matron of the sacred. Yet she remained practical. Her patronage of Buddhism never came at the cost of governance. She ensured that temple lands did not escape taxation. She demanded that monks engage in community service. She watched for corruption with the same eye she used on generals. Her spirituality was not romantic. It was rooted in responsibility. Late at night, when the palace grew quiet, she would light a single lamp in her chamber and read sutras copied by her attendants. The flame flickered, the ink shimmered, and in the silence, she found the same peace she once felt as a girl under the stars of the Mongolian plain. She was no longer that girl. She was the heart of an empire, an empress cloaked not in conquest, but in contemplation. A woman who had made Buddhism the conscience of a dynasty. And in doing so, she had changed the meaning of power not through conversion, but by showing that power could be guided by mercy. The lotus had bloomed in the shadow of the Khan, and at its roots was Chabi. Chabi had always understood that empires were not measured by the breadth of their borders, but by the strength of what held them together when the world began to pull them apart. In the years following the foundation of the Yuan dynasty, after the pageantry of coronation faded and the dust of succession war settled, Kublai's ambitions turned outward once more. His eyes, no longer satisfied with the conquest of China, scanned the ocean and the jungles, the islands beyond maps, the distant horizons where resistance still stirred. To Chabi, the horizon now shimmered less with promise than with quiet warning. When Kublai announced the first campaign against Japan, Chabi said nothing. She had seen this desire before, in his youth, when glory was still a chase and not a burden, and in his middle years, when the empire was growing so fast that even he seemed unable to follow its full shape. Japan had refused to bow. Their shogunate had not sent tribute, had not knelt, had not answered letters written in a dozen languages. To the court it was defiance. To Kublai, it was a challenge to the legitimacy of his rule under heaven. And so the order came and the ships were built. Chabi watched as the trees of southern China fell, as forests were turned into fleets, as grain destined for famine relief was redirected to feed soldiers who would not see home again. Blacksmiths who once made tools now forged arrowheads. Temples lost their offerings. Markets emptied of able-bodied men. Dadu grew quiet. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence that preceded a storm. The first invasion was a disaster. Launched in haste, scattered by logistics, undone by weather, and finally shattered by the wind that would become legend, Kublai's fleet never reached its true enemy. The typhoon that struck the Mongol ships off the coast of Kyushu drowned men by the tens of thousands. The survivors crawled ashore only to be slaughtered by Japanese defenders. The sea, it seemed, had risen in defense of the islands. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind. The name stuck. It drifted across the ocean with the debris of broken ships, and into the palace of Dadu where Chabi stood still, receiving the news not with tears, but with a long-drawn breath. She had feared this, not the loss of a war, but the awakening of something deeper, fragility. For the first time since the rise of Kublai, the word limit found its way into the whispers of the court. Chabi knew how such words spread. One defeat led to doubt, and doubt gave rise to rebellion. It was not Japan that would break the Yuan. It was the echo of its resistance within the empire's own walls. Kublai, shaken but not broken, ordered a second invasion. This time it would be larger. Twice the number of ships, more troops, more generals, better weather watchers. Buddhist monks were summoned to bless the fleet. Astrologers declared the signs favorable. Chabi, seated at the emperor's side in council, said little. But her hands trembled once beneath her sleeves when a report from the south noted the absence of certain winds. She remembered a time before the empire, before Dadu, when they had spoken as equals. When he had listened not only to her words but to her silences. That time felt distant now, and yet she remained close, because someone had to remain when he left again. While Kublai's new armada set sail, Chabi stayed behind. She did not follow him to war, nor ask to. Her war was in Dadu. The empire was tired. The peasantry had been taxed to near starvation. Southern China, only recently pacified, simmered with unrest. Bandits grew bold again in the hills. Provincial officials, unsure of whether the center still held, began to hoard grain and stall reforms. Ministers argued over every decree, splitting into camps loyal to Mongol tradition, Chinese practicality, or personal survival. Chabi moved between them like wind through reed grass. She issued edicts to protect orphan children in war-torn villages. She released temple lands from taxation for a season, ensuring food could be distributed to those whose fields had been abandoned. She recalled corrupt magistrates with quiet efficiency, replacing them not with favorites, but with the most competent she could find. Men and women who remembered what it meant to serve before they ruled. She strengthened the intelligence network, not to suppress dissent, but to listen. Letters from mountain towns, reports from grain inspectors, notes from midwives. She read them all. Where she could not intervene directly, she sent money, advice, spiritual guidance. Where famine threatened, she opened granaries. Where rebellion stirred, she sent teachers instead of troops. Where despair settled, she built hope, brick by brick, with no need for ceremony. She did all of this not because she sought credit, but because the alternative was collapse. The news of the second invasion came on a night of rain. Another typhoon, another broken fleet. The coast of Japan was lined with the corpses of men who had never learned its language. Survivors returned in silence, and this time, even Kublai did not speak of it. He withdrew for days into the inner chambers of the palace, emerging only to conduct the most necessary affairs of state. Chabi entered once, with no attendants, and found him staring at a map of the empire. His hand hovered over the eastern sea. He did not move. She did not speak. She sat beside him, and for a long time, they shared the silence that only rulers can understand. The silence of knowing the world was too large for anyone will to hold. After that, things changed. Kublai began to drink more. He became less patient in court. He stopped attending some rituals. The man who had once governed with vision now governed with momentum, and it was Chabi who worked quietly behind him to keep that momentum from turning into inertia. Her role deepened. Ministers came to her first, before they brought their troubles to the emperor. Diplomats requested her presence in negotiations. Even generals, long dismissive of women's counsel, sought her judgment in matters of morale and logistics. She had become, without title or fanfare, the true fulcrum of the Yuan court. But not even she could prevent what came next. In the south, rebellions began to grow. In Dai Viet, the Tran dynasty, though outmatched militarily, refused to yield. In Burma, alliances frayed. In the western khanates, cousins of Kublai began to act independently, issuing decrees in their own names, ignoring orders from Dadu. The empire, so vast and seemingly invincible, began to show the cracks Chabi had long feared. She did not panic. She adapted. She diverted funds from the court's lavish ceremonies to fund disaster relief. She strengthened ties with Tibetan monasteries and sent trusted monks into troubled provinces to preach stability through faith. She arranged marriages between powerful clans to neutralize rivalries. She restored local self-governance in several regions to reduce strain on imperial bureaucracy. At the same time, her own household began to dim. Several of her closest attendants died. Old age, illness, exhaustion. Her daughter, whom she had not seen in years, passed away in the south during a cholera outbreak. The letter arrived quietly, unaccompanied by gifts or formal condolences. Chabi read it, folded it, and placed it in a lacquered box. That night, she walked the gardens alone and watched the moon rise without joy. Yet she remained steady. For the people, she was more than a ruler. She was the symbol of what remained noble in the Yuan dynasty. In a court increasingly driven by self-interest, Chabi still ruled for others. And they knew it. The common people placed her portrait on home altars beside the Buddha. Pilgrims traveled to Dadu not just to see the city, but to leave offerings at the gates in her name. Her birthdays were marked by spontaneous festivals in towns far beyond the capital. She did not encourage any of it, but she did not stop it either. She understood the power of faith and the cost of losing it. Then came the famine. A series of failed harvests in the north, compounded by floods in the south, created a cascade of shortages. Grain prices tripled. Trade routes broke down. Panic spread. Some provinces declared emergencies. Others declared themselves autonomous. Chabi responded faster than the emperor. She activated emergency stores, coordinated transport of rice from coastal regions, and opened the palace's own food reserves. She suspended taxes across 5 provinces and sent medical teams drawn from both Buddhist and Confucian schools. She addressed the people directly, letters read in temples, proclamations nailed to gates. She signed each one not with a title but with a single name, Chabi. And it was enough. For a little while, the empire breathed again, if only shallowly. Kublai, seeing her success, offered public praise. But his eyes had changed. He looked not at her, but through her, toward something unreachable. Victory, legacy, control. All the things he feared he was losing. And she, the woman who had once kindled his fire, now worked only to keep him warm. In private they still spoke, but less often. Sometimes he did not hear her. Sometimes she did not try. She had become an empress of silence. And yet, in that silence she ruled. Through war, through famine, through rebellion, she was the one who remained. The death of a child alters the geometry of time. It fractures the rhythm of memory. It loosens the soil beneath every triumph, every building, every law. For Chabi, who had spent her life shaping an empire from the chaos of war and faith, the death of her son was not merely a private grief. It was a crack that ran through the foundation of the world she had built. Zhenjin had been more than a prince. He had been a promise. Born into the turbulent dawn of the Yuan dynasty, Zhenjin grew up between 2 worlds, the rigor of Mongol tradition and the refinement of Chinese civilization. Chabi had raised him not as a conqueror, but as a steward. She had taught him history not as a litany of victories, but as a lesson in consequences. She brought to his chambers Confucian scholars who instructed him in governance, Buddhist monks who whispered of detachment, generals who taught restraint. He learned calligraphy alongside horsemanship, philosophy beside tactics. He was the embodiment of what the Yuan might become. Not just an empire of might, but one of meaning. From an early age, it was clear that Kublai favored him. Among his many sons, Shinjin alone carried the quiet composure of Chabi, the strategic instinct of his father, and the grace that made both soldiers and scholars kneel willingly. He did not seek praise. He sought balance. In the court, he was respected. In the provinces, he was revered. In the eyes of the people, he was the future. But the future has no obligation to the present. Shinjin's health had long been delicate. The demands of administration, of travel, of expectation, they weighed on him. His body betrayed him before his will ever did. By his 30s, he was frequently ill. Doctors came and went. Herbalists brewed potions. Monks offered prayers. But Chabi, watching from the shadows of the palace, saw the fading in his eyes long before anyone dared speak of it. Then, one autumn, in a residence outside Dadu, Shinjin collapsed. The report reached the palace with the calm cruelty of all bad news. He had died quickly, they said. Peacefully, they insisted. Chabi read the words in silence. Her hands did not tremble. She folded the letter, placed it before her on the lacquered desk, and stared at it until night swallowed the room. Kublai's reaction was volcanic. He wept openly, raged at the heavens, accused doctors, banished attendants. For days, he did not rise from bed. The court ground to a halt. Ministers waited for orders that never came. And in the center of the storm, Chabi did what she had always done. She endured. But this grief was unlike any before. This was not a battle lost, nor a temple burned, nor a famine endured. This was her child, her legacy, her heart. She had once whispered into his ear that he was the reason she accepted the burdens of the empire. Now that anchor had been cut, and still she could not fall, because everything else still stood because she did. The mourning rites were performed with exquisite precision. Shinjin was buried with the honors of an emperor, though he had never sat on the throne. Kublai declared a month of silence. Bells were muffled. Colors disappeared from the palace. Priests chanted day and night. And when it ended, nothing had changed except the people who remained. Chabi withdrew from ceremony. She appeared less in court, spoke more softly, wrote more letters in her own hand. She spent long hours in the private shrine she had built for herself years before, a small space lit only by oil lamps, with a single scroll bearing the image of Avalokiteshvara, the thousand-armed Bodhisattva. She did not ask why her son had died. Buddhism had long ago freed her from such questions. But she asked what it meant. What did it mean for a dynasty to lose its center of balance? Shinjin had been more than heir. He had been a symbol of transition, the thread between Kublai's conquest and the possibility of permanence. Without him, that thread frayed. The question of succession returned, as it always does in empires. Other sons emerged, ambitious, capable, but not Shinjin. Ministers formed factions. Mongol nobles pushed for traditional lines of inheritance. Chinese officials advocated for stability. The court became a chessboard again, and the pieces moved in whispers. Chabi watched. She listened, but she no longer moved with urgency. Her grief was not weakness, it was clarity. She could see the game more clearly now because she no longer played to win. She played to preserve. She supported Timur, Shinjin's own son, a boy barely of age but already marked by his grandfather's presence. Timur had Chabi's eyes and Shinjin's poise. He lacked his father's depth, but he listened. And in listening, Chabi believed there was still hope. She called Timur to the palace. Not in public, not with ceremony, but in private, beneath a garden pavilion surrounded by plum blossoms and the soft trickle of water. There, she spoke to him not as an empress, not even as a grandmother, but as the last bearer of a vision too fragile to die with her son. She told him what the empire had cost, what it needed, what it could become. She gave him no commandments, only a mirror. He listened, and in that listening, she placed her last political wager. In the months that followed, she re-entered the court. She attended sessions with the same composure as always, But now her presence carried a deeper gravity. She did not speak often, but when she did, the room held its breath. Ministers deferred. Nobles waited. Even Kublai, now grayer, heavier, and more withdrawn, turned to her with the eyes of a man who had lost the one thing he could not replace. She sat beside him as he signed decrees. She guided his hand when it shook. She edited edicts in her own calligraphy when the scribes faltered. She became not just his partner, but his memory. The empire she had helped shape was still there, but altered. The borders held. The roads functioned. The bureaucracy churned. But beneath it all was fatigue. The people still believed in the Yuan, but less fervently. The rebellions had not ended, only quieted. The wealth of conquest had slowed. The dream of a universal empire had begun to seem like an echo. And so Chabi turned inward again. She spent her final energies not on expansion, but on consolidation. She established endowments for Buddhist schools. She funded the copying of texts in multiple languages: Mongolian, Chinese, Tibetan, Persian. She commissioned artists to paint murals of harmony, not battle. She ordered the planting of trees along the imperial roads, so that even long after the dynasty passed, travelers would remember the shape of peace. She began writing reflections, not memoirs, but meditations. They were never published, but in them, she wrote of impermanence, of suffering, of leadership, of love, of her son. And though the ink has faded, the echo of those words remains, in the architecture of the capital, in the laws that outlasted their creators, in the image of an empire that did not collapse in fury, but endured in memory. When Chabi died not long after, it was not with fanfare. There were no processions, no new temples built. Her passing was marked by the quiet closing of a door, the folding of a scroll, the dimming of a lamp. But across the empire, candles were lit. And in the minds of those who still remembered the years when order held, when justice walked in silence, when mercy had a name, they whispered it once more. Chabi, not as a title, but as a prayer. The empire she had helped build did not crack in the thunder of war. It bent inward, slowly and silently, in the rooms where candles burned low and power wore a smile. It was not the armies that threatened the Yuan at this moment. It was the whispers. It was the ambition that wore silk. It was the serpents that slithered through the halls of Dadu not with daggers, but with favors, alliances, and false praise. And Chabi knew them all. She had seen them born. She had seen them rise. Now she watched them coil. After the death of Jinjin, a void remained in the center of the court that no ceremony could fill. His son Timur had been named heir in principle, but not all agreed in silence. Other sons of Kublai, less beloved but still legitimate, hovered at the edges of succession. They carried their mother's ambitions with them, mothers who had never held Chabi's sway but who now sensed a shift in gravity. In every empire, there comes a time when the strongest walls are tested from within. This was that time. Chabi had never underestimated the threat of the inner court. Long before soldiers crossed borders, long before generals moved chess pieces of territory, the real game had always begun in the chambers where influence was traded like perfume. She knew how power moved, not just by decree, but by glance, by who poured the tea, by who dared to linger one step too long behind a silk curtain. There were women who had waited years for Chabi's star to dim. Some were minor consorts from early campaigns, others recently elevated nobles eager to write their own futures into the royal record. Most had no love for Kublai, only for the thrones their sons might inherit. They had watched Chabi mold the dynasty through patience and policy. And now, with the emperor growing heavier, older, and more distant, and the empress quieter than ever, they saw their chance. Rumors began to crawl through the palace. Timur was too young. Timur was too close to Chinese ministers. Timur lacked the fire of his grandfather. Behind closed doors, names were spoken. Sons more aggressive, more Mongol, more pure. A campaign was rising not against Timur, but against the legacy of what Chabi had spent decades weaving. And yet, Chabi did not speak. She observed. She watched as a certain general, long loyal, began attending private dinners hosted by a rival consort. She noted which letters arrived late, which edicts were edited before the emperor saw them. She took no immediate action. She allowed the patterns to form, to expose themselves, to become undeniable. Patience was not inaction. It was precision. One night, during a gathering of court officials and their families, a celebration of spring renewal, Chabi entered dressed not in morning black, but in royal white, her hair pinned with only a single jade comb. She moved through the crowd without attendance, without introduction. Conversations froze, eyes lowered. Even her enemies felt a tremor. She spoke only once that evening, before a mural depicting the 4 seasons. "Time," she said, "does not ask our permission to change, but it does remember who built what it inherits." The message was clear. She would not defend her influence. It did not need defending. It was written in the roads, the laws, the temples, the stability they all depended on. Any attempt to tear it down would collapse the house they all lived in. But warnings do not stop ambition. Weeks later, an assassination attempt was uncovered. Not on Chabi, not on Timur, on one of her most trusted ministers, an elderly administrator who had once tutored Jinjin and now advised the young heir. The poison was crude. The evidence traced not to a knife, but to a letter, forged and planted, meant to cast suspicion on Timur himself. It failed. But the message was sent. Chabi responded. She summoned a private gathering of the inner court, the senior consorts, their sons, their attendants. No generals, no ministers, no scribes, only the women who had always understood that the empire was as much theirs as it was the emperor's. There were no accusations, no executions, no punishments, only a reading. She opened an ancient scroll, a parable from the steppes, of a falcon who mistook a serpent for prey, only to be swallowed whole when it swooped too low. When the scroll was finished, she looked at each woman in turn. No one spoke. No one needed to. Afterward, one consort requested reassignment to a monastery. Another sent her son to serve on the western frontier. The whispers faded. The serpent recoiled. But not all threats lived in the court. In the provinces, especially in the south, the memory of the Song dynasty still lingered. Tax protests began to flare. Scholar officials submitted passive-aggressive petitions questioning the ethics of Mongol land policies. In the north, some Mongol princes began convening their own regional councils without imperial permission. The idea of unity, once so potent, had begun to dull at the edges. Chabi focused on restoring coherence. She quietly increased funding for education in both Chinese and Mongolian. She reauthorized local governance councils in areas where unrest stirred. She expanded the imperial printing project, ensuring that Buddhist texts and imperial decrees circulated in all the major languages of the empire. She visited temples and schools without fanfare, showing the people that even if the emperor was distant, the empire still watched, still cared. She also held daily sessions with Timur, grooming him not for a throne alone, but for a world fraying at its margins. She trained him not to react, but to reflect, not to dominate, but to navigate. She brought him to meetings where ministers bickered. She allowed him to watch as she defused conflicts with a glance, or unraveled lies with a single, well-placed fact. She was not preparing him to be loved. She was preparing him to be necessary. Kublai, meanwhile, grew heavier both in body and mind. He rarely left the palace. His once sharp decisions now came slower. He trusted fewer people. And yet, he still trusted Chabi. On his weakest days, he called only for her. And she came every time, sat beside him, held his hand, whispered verses from the Diamond Sutra until he fell asleep. She had become the gravity that kept him from floating into despair. And so the court endured. The serpent's head had been crushed, but its coils remained. There would always be those who hungered for more, who mistook power for destiny. But so long as Chabi lived, the empire had memory. And so long as the empire remembered, it could resist. Because in the end, it was not conquest that preserved dynasties. It was wisdom, and she, above all, had never run out of that. The air in the palace had changed. It was no longer the tension of rebellion, nor the thrill of conquests planned and executed. It was quieter now, heavier. Not defeat, but fatigue, an empire grown vast enough to forget its own edges. Dadu continued to hum with administration, with ritual, with the theater of imperial control, but beneath the surface, time had begun to press inward, and the court could feel it. Chabi moved through the halls like a spirit, revered by all and understood by few. Her presence was no longer questioned, because it had become part of the structure itself. Like the walls, like the mountains in the distance, like the seasons that turned regardless of decree. She spoke less now, but every word carried the gravity of precedent. No one challenged her authority. They simply aligned with it or fell away quietly. Kublai had withdrawn. His body, once strong and vigorous, bore the marks of time and indulgence. His steps were slow, his moods erratic. There were days he did not leave his chambers. Other days he demanded full councils and spoke of new campaigns, only to forget his orders the next morning. The generals humored him. The ministers obeyed. But the true governance of the empire passed more and more through Chabi's hands. She did not claim the throne. She did not need to. She was the breath between decisions, the clarity in the fog of indecision. She was the continuity that Kublai's aging mind could no longer guarantee. And in that space, she turned her gaze outward, not toward war, but toward unity. The empire had grown too large to be ruled by sword and decree alone. The Silk Roads stretched into Persia. The sea lanes touched Java, India, and Africa. Merchants, pilgrims, translators, envoys each brought with them not only goods but gods. The empire was no longer just Mongol or Chinese or Buddhist. It was everything, and that chaos needed a language. Chabi chose faith. She did not privilege one. She invited all. She called for the establishment of the Imperial Council of Faiths, a body of religious leaders from across the empire, not to debate theology, but to coordinate peace. Buddhists, Taoists, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Zoroastrians, and even Nestorians sat together in chambers lit by lanterns and watched by guards from every province. They were not asked to agree. They were asked to coexist. And under Chabi's guidance, they did. She appointed an Uyghur Muslim physician to the imperial hospital. A Jewish mathematician from Central Asia became a court scholar. She had Nestorian crosses and Buddhist lotus symbols carved into the same pillars of newly constructed temples. She did not blur lines. She held them in tension, each thread visible, each one sacred. The court balked, then adapted. The people, wearied by decades of war and suspicion, found comfort in this new arrangement. Suddenly, differences were not threats. They were parts of the whole. The empire no longer claimed to be pure, claimed to be possible. Chabi's policies extended beyond symbolism. She mandated religious holidays for minority communities be respected in tax collection and legal proceedings. She forbade the destruction of temples and churches, even in newly annexed regions. She demanded that sacred texts be translated and stored in the imperial archives, alongside government records and war chronicles. She commissioned a grand project, the Codex of Harmony, an anthology of teachings from all faiths represented within the empire, bound in silk, written in multiple scripts, and distributed to provincial governors. It was not propaganda. It was insurance, a reminder that tolerance was now imperial policy. The effort was enormous. Scribes worked day and night. Translators debated over precise meanings of ancient prayers. Artists illustrated the pages with images of unity. Priests and monks, shepherds and scholars, walking side by side. It was Chabi's final infrastructure, not of stone, but of belief. As her policy spread, so did her legend. Stories circulated of the Empress who had once blessed a Christian chapel with incense, who had meditated in a mosque's quiet courtyard, who had bowed to the teachings of Confucius without betraying her devotion to the Buddha. She became a living icon of balance, a vessel through which the empire's contradictions were not erased, but acknowledged and allowed to breathe. But legends grow clearest when the body begins to fade. Chabi's health had declined quietly. It was not illness. It was erosion. She slept less. She ate sparingly. Her once vibrant voice now rasped, and her eyes, though still sharp, took longer to focus. Yet she worked. She met with advisors. She wrote letters. She read reports with a magnifying glass. Her hands steady, her will undiminished. She refused to step away, because she knew the moment she did, the gravity holding the empire in place would shift. The nobles knew it too. In the dark corners of the court, maneuvering returned. Factions revived. Old ambitions stirred. But no one moved openly. Not yet, because Chabi still walked the halls. When foreign dignitaries came, they no longer asked for the emperor. They asked if the Empress Dowager would receive them. Her audiences were short, but unforgettable. She greeted each guest with a phrase in their own tongue, offered a gift symbolic of their faith, and asked a single question about their homeland. They left feeling seen. When the Codex of Harmony was completed, a grand ceremony was held. Representatives from every faith gathered in the capital. Kublai, now too weak to stand long, sat beside Chabi as she handed the first copy to the imperial archivist. It was bound in red silk, stitched with gold thread, sealed with the imperial stamp and her own signature. The moment passed without spectacle. But in it, she had done something rare. She had created a shared future. And yet, in the quiet of her chamber, Chabi knew what history could not yet admit, that it would not last. She had seen the cycles. She had read the records. Empires bend. They break. The best one can do is plant seeds beneath the stones. She began writing letters to Timur, not instructions but reflections, on how to listen, on how to decide, on how to survive being emperor without forgetting how to be human. She gave him no strategies, only reminders, that people remember justice more than triumph, that silence is sometimes wiser than command, that the best rulers do not leave monuments, they leave order. She also wrote to the abbots of distant monasteries, to the elders of mountain villages, to the heads of schools and temples. She thanked them, asked them to remain, promised that their service would outlast her life. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. The Empress was preparing to die. She made no farewell, only gestures. She visited the shrine of her youth, where a Tibetan monk had once told her she would shape the fate of millions. She walked the palace gardens one last time, touching the bark of each tree she had planted. She summoned the artisans who had worked on the codex and gifted each of them a silk robe. And then, one night she asked to be alone. She lit a single lamp. She recited the Heart Sutra. She drank tea brewed from the first leaves of the spring harvest. She wrote one final line in her diary. I was here, and the world continued. In the morning she was gone. There was no scream, no weeping, only stillness. When the court awoke, the capital did not fall into panic. It bowed. The bells rang low across Dadu. In temples, prayers in dozens of languages rose into the air. Across the empire, markets paused, streets emptied, and silence returned once more, this time in mourning. But it was not only mourning, it was gratitude. The Empress of all faiths, the heart of an empire that had tried to hold the world together, had left without fear, without spectacle, without undoing what she built. And in her absence, the world remembered not only what she ruled, but what she held. She had always known that she would die before him. That was the nature of the tether that held the empire together, stretched between her mind and his name. He had conquered the world, but she had kept it from consuming him. And now, with her gone, there was no one left who knew how to hold both sword and silence in the same hand. Chabi Khatun was dead, and Kublai Khan, the most powerful man on earth, was alone. The court wore its grief in layers. Black robes, slow steps, bowed heads. The capital city dimmed itself. Temple bells tolled at quarter hours for 7 days. Priests of every faith offered rites. From the steppes of Mongolia to the deltas of the south, Emissaries arrived in silence bearing condolences and scrolls of prayer. In Tibet, monks carved her name into cliffs. In China, scholars wrote verses in her memory. In Persia, a single white tulip was placed on the imperial altar. No decree ordered these things. They happened because she had reached them all. And yet, amidst the rituals of mourning, something heavier began to settle. Kublai Khan did not attend the public rites. He did not weep before the court. He did not make proclamations. He disappeared. He withdrew to a small residence in the western quarter of the palace, the place where they had once walked gardens together, where she had read to him from scrolls and whispered to him when the empire's weight pressed too hard against his chest. Now the gardens were overgrown, the benches unattended, the scrolls untouched. He ate little, slept sporadically. The attendants changed often, unable to bear the silence that filled the room. When Kublai did speak, it was to no one in particular. He would ask questions as if Chabi were still there. He would begin to speak, stop, then dismiss the servant with a wave. His mind, once sharp as obsidian, now moved through a fog that even the generals feared to cross. The court continued in ritual. The state moved on as empires must. But inside its walls, everyone knew the truth. Chabi had not simply died. The compass had been shattered. She had been the axis of the wheel, and without her, even the strongest spokes trembled. Kublai's judgment became inconsistent. Some days, he was lucid, summoning advisors, discussing taxes, giving audience. Other days, he vanished into his chambers, refusing to be disturbed, obsessively rereading old letters she had written, or reciting Buddhist verses with a monk she would have trusted. When reports came of border unrest, he ignored them. When suggestions came to crown Timur as heir formally, he waved them away. No one knew which version of the emperor they would meet from hour to hour. His body followed the path his mind had taken. The weight he had carried turned literal. He grew swollen. His legs ached. He could no longer ride. He could barely walk. Once, a court artist tried to paint him and was dismissed in fury. The canvas showing a man too old, too tired, too real. The emperor, who had once been the storm, now feared the mirror. The ministers held meetings without him. Decisions were delayed, then delegated. Timur, the young grandson groomed by Chabi, stepped forward cautiously. He did not assert himself. He simply filled the spaces she had shown him. He consulted the same advisors, answered letters in her style, listened more than he spoke. The people began to accept him, but always with a caveat. He was not Chabi. He would never be. Beyond the palace walls, the empire shifted. In the south, former Song loyalists tested the edges of Yuan control. In the northwest, the Ilkhanate began ignoring imperial communication. In the steppes, some Mongol clans whispered that Kublai had lost the mandate of heaven. Rebellions did not erupt. They waited. The world held its breath, watching the slow, sad unraveling of a ruler who had become an echo of his own shadow. And in the silence, Chabi's absence became her greatest presence. It was only now, in the months that followed her death, that the ministers understood how much of the empire she had truly governed. The schools she had funded sent no more reports. The temple networks she had managed grew disorganized. The interfaith councils she had coordinated slowly dissolved into mutual suspicion. Even the roads, once maintained on her personal orders, fell into disrepair as local governors hesitated to spend money without her explicit blessing. Every corner of the empire had, in some way, been tethered to her hand. Now the hand was gone. Kublai began speaking of her openly, but only in fragments. He would quote her out of context. He would bring her name into meetings she had never attended. Once, in front of foreign envoys, he referred to her as the one true ruler of this house, and then dismissed them without further explanation. He began seeing her, not in dreams, but in the way grief often shapes hallucination into memory. He spoke to her in gardens, answered questions she never asked, laughed at things only they had shared. Attendants were forbidden to interrupt. Those who did were replaced. The empire adjusted, as it always had, because empires do not end when rulers fade. They end when memory fades, and memory, Chabi's memory, remained powerful. Timur, now older, assumed more responsibility. He began issuing edicts in his own name. He visited provinces. He met with generals. He sat in the same seat she had once occupied during council, his hands always resting where hers had been. He carried her teachings into his own policies: moderation, tolerance, listening. And yet, even he could not match the subtle gravity she had exercised. One evening, a letter arrived at the palace. It was from a village in the mountains of Tibet. Inside was a single sentence, written in calligraphy both crude and beautiful. She walked through our valley once, and the flowers have never forgotten. It was placed on the emperor's table. He read it, folded it, then stared at the wall for an hour. Later that night, he summoned the palace archivist and ordered a final record written. "Let it be known," he said, "that the Empress Chabi ruled without crown, without title, and without war, but with more power than any man who ever carried a sword. She did not demand loyalty, she inspired it, and in doing so, she made an empire worthy of its name." He died within the year, not in battle, not in glory, in bed, surrounded by monks chanting the same prayers she once recited. There was no storm, only a breath. The empire mourned him, but it remembered her. Long after the Yuan dynasty fell, long after the capitals were renamed and the scrolls rewritten, the stories of Chabi remained. Not just in temples or textbooks, but in the voices of women who ruled from behind veils, in the hands of governors who placed order above pride, in the dreams of philosophers who dared to believe that unity was possible without uniformity. They called her the Empress of Balance, the quiet storm, the mother of the Middle Kingdom. But she had never cared for titles. She cared for what endured. And though the wind erased her footsteps from the sand, the land she walked still bore her shape. She had never asked for monuments, yet they built them. In stone and scroll and song, they etched her name. Not always correctly, not always with reverence, but always with consequence. After her passing, the empire she helped stabilize did not collapse. It carried forward, heavy with momentum, the way a great river keeps moving long after its source has dried. But rivers, when unguarded, change course. And so did the Yuan. Timur ascended as emperor, though the ceremonies were modest and the announcements cautious. He ruled not in his grandfather's shadow, but in his grandmother's design. From the very beginning of his reign, it was Chabi's vision that served as his blueprint. Her language in his edicts, her diplomacy in his court, her priorities in his investments. He preserved the schools she had funded, reinforced the religious tolerance she institutionalized, and even continued the imperial printing of the Codex of Harmony. His advisors, many of whom had once served her directly, guided him more with her memory than with his authority. But legacies are not kept, they are contested. By the third year of Timur's reign, new voices emerged within the court. Younger ministers, Mongol nobles born in the late days of Kublai's expansion, questioned the policies of moderation. They whispered that the dynasty had grown soft under Chabi's hand, that the empire, once forged in conquest, now coddled its enemies with inclusion and indulgence. They pointed to the unrest in the provinces, not as failures of imperial logistics, but as evidence that the multiculturalism Chabi had championed was fracturing the very soul of Mongol identity. They did not speak against her name. No one dared, but they questioned her choices. Slowly, strategically, they reframed her as necessary for her time, but dangerous for theirs. A beautiful chapter, they said, but now the empire needed a new script. Timur resisted, not with force, but with persistence. He argued that stability was not weakness, that the true strength of the Yuan lay in its ability to incorporate, not dominate. But even he could feel the tide turning. His ministers grew bolder. The tribal councils of the Mongol heartlands began refusing imperial emissaries. Religious councils that once coexisted began retreating into insularity. Temples were vandalized. Local militias clashed. The unity that Chabi had once held like silk in her fingers now frayed in the wind. And yet, in strange places, her influence returned. In a port city near the southern coast, a local governor introduced a new taxation policy based on the recommendations in a scroll authored by Chabi during her early years. It brought fairness to the merchant class and quelled a brewing rebellion. In a monastery high in the mountains, a Buddhist monk began distributing fragments of the Codex of Harmony, reminding feuding religious communities that coexistence was not surrender. In a school in the far west, a young Uyghur girl was taught mathematics using a textbook published during Chabi's reign. She would grow up to become a court scholar. Her legacy did not stand in the halls of power. It bloomed in the margins. But the center Dadu had changed. Timur grew tired, not of the empire, but of fighting for its soul alone. He found himself increasingly isolated. His own court split between loyalists to Chabi's dream and proponents of a more aggressive, nationalistic vision. He turned inward, seeking counsel not from generals, but from scrolls, her letters, her annotations, her marginalia. They became his scripture. One winter, he visited the old garden where she used to walk. It had been neglected, the stone paths cracked, the plum trees wild. He ordered it restored, not by architects, but by those who had once known her. The gardeners, the scribes, the old nurse who still remembered the scent of her perfume. They gathered in silence, each movement a form of prayer. When the work was done, Timur walked it alone. He carried no seal, wore no crown, just robes the color of snow. In the center of the garden stood the statue. It had not been ordered by the court. It had been sculpted in secret, commissioned by artisans whose families had lived under her protection. It was not a likeness. It was a symbol. A woman standing between two mountains, her arms open, her eyes closed. Not in death, but in listening. There was no plaque, no title, only one word carved beneath her feet. Balance. Timur wept, not for her, but for the world that no longer understood what she had given. In the years that followed, political tides continued to shift. The empire held barely. Corruption seeped in. Local rebellions flared. The bureaucracy grew bloated. And yet, every time collapse threatened, someone somewhere invoked her name, as a reason to wait, as a reason to repair, as a reason to remember. One such moment came in the form of a child. A young girl, orphaned in the aftermath of a failed rebellion, was taken in by a remote temple. She had no memory of her parents, but she could recite verses from the Codex by heart. When asked where she had learned them, she said, "The lady in white tells me in my dreams." At first, the monks thought it imagination. But when the girl began translating texts she had never read aloud, they reconsidered. They named her a vessel. They trained her. Years later, she would become one of the empire's most respected philosophers, writing under a pseudonym that translated to daughter of Chabi. In another corner of the empire, a former military commander, once a critic of Chabi's soft policies, found himself governing a restive province. He tried suppression, failed. He tried isolation, it backfired. Finally, in desperation, he implemented a reconstruction plan based on old imperial blueprints, ones drawn under Chabi's direction. Within 3 years, the region prospered. He never spoke her name in public. But in private, he kept a jade carving she had once gifted his father. And in a quiet act of repentance, he commissioned a school. Its motto, "Strength with Wisdom." By the end of Timur's reign, the court had become a quieter place. Not because it was at peace, but because too many voices had spoken at once, and the empire now strained under the weight of contradiction. He died with fewer enemies than his grandfather, but also with fewer allies. His funeral was dignified, but small. The real mourning happened outside the capital. In the monasteries, in the markets, in the schools Chabi had built. There, her memory was not debated. It was lived. She had been the pulse of an empire, and though the body still moved, the heart had long since stopped. It began as wind, not storm, not rebellion, just a wind, quiet, persistent, forgetting no doorframe or alley or temple corner. It moved through Dadu, carrying with it a kind of breathlessness. People began to speak in lowered tones. Officials postponed meetings. Foreign envoys lingered in their guest quarters, writing reports with phrases like uncertainty, instability, and fraying legitimacy. Even the palace animals grew restless. No one could name the feeling, but everyone recognized its shape. The Yuan Empire was dying, not with thunder or flame, but with erosion. Grain shipments delayed, garrisons unpaid, roads unguarded, laws unenforced. Across the provinces, governors made decisions without consulting the capital. Armies responded to gold more than command. The Mongol identity, once proud and united, split into fragments, loyalty to tribe overtaking loyalty to crown. And through it all, the shadow of Chabi still lingered. Not in the throne room, no one there spoke of her anymore, but in the corners, in whispers, in the hands of scribes who still copied her decrees as models of linguistic clarity, in the minds of provincial midwives who remembered her medical edicts that once saved children from winter fever, in the lantern-light reflections of a generation that had grown up under her gaze, now watching the world forget. The emperor by now was not a Khan, but a ghost in ceremonial dress. Several successions had passed since Timur's reign, each ruler weaker than the last, each reign shorter. The throne, once unshakable beneath Kublai's weight, now creaked under men who ruled by proximity to power rather than its possession. The mandate of heaven, once affirmed in every sunrise, now felt like a fable. But memory is stubborn. Far from the capital, in the forests near what is now modern-day Yunnan, a young woman studied at a monastery built under Chabi's patronage. She had never seen a Mongol banner. She did not know the names of the emperors who followed Kublai, but she could recite every passage of the Codex of Harmony. She considered Chabi a saint, though no such canonization existed. To her, the empire was not a dynasty or a lineage. It was a woman's choice to create peace where others had expected domination. In the city of Hangzhou, a dying merchant donated his entire fortune to rebuild a school that had once educated his grandfather, a school funded by Chabi's outreach to coastal provinces. He asked that no statue be built, only a garden, quiet, unadorned, open to all creeds. Even in the steppes, where many had long since turned bitter toward Kublai's cosmopolitan vision, elders remembered her, not with warmth, but with respect. She had not been one of them, not truly, but she had honored their ways. She had walked the windswept earth barefoot. She had sat with them beside their fires. She had listened. History books rarely wrote of her in detail. She was mentioned in relation to Kublai, consort, a Buddhist, a supporter of the arts, but they never captured the full scope. They did not see the tendons in the hand that held the empire's neck steady. They did not chart the invisible architecture she designed, the inner scaffolding of administration, trust, and tolerance. Instead, her influence bled into myth. Some said she could read minds, that she once turned away an assassin not by force, but by asking him the name of his mother. That during one famine, she fed an entire province with grain levied not from peasants, but from the jewelry gifted to her at her coronation. That she wrote a secret codex no one has yet found, containing prophecies of dynasties yet to rise. Of course, none of that was true. What was true was quieter. She had once rewritten a taxation policy to exempt flood-prone regions. She had stopped a pogrom with a single letter. She had negotiated peace between rival religious sects not by decree, but by offering them rooms on the same floor of the palace. She had trained dozens of young women to read, not to liberate them, but to prepare them for a world that might one day demand their wisdom. The final years of the Yuan were marked by fracture. The Red Turban Rebellion, the rise of local warlords, the inexorable advance of the Ming. Dadu fell not in a great siege, but in exhaustion. The palaces were ransacked, the archives looted, the silks burned, and as the imperial court fled northward, carrying what little dignity remained, no one spoke of Chabi. But she was still there, In a scroll buried beneath a floorboard in the imperial library, spared from fire by accident, her handwriting remained. In a song sung by boat women on the Yangtze, about a queen who asked for no gold but demanded clean water. In the inscriptions beneath broken statues, where her name had been scratched out but never replaced. And then, centuries later, a scholar found her, not in a grand revelation but in footnotes, a female name listed next to major reforms, a signature attached to construction orders, a line in a Tibetan manuscript citing her as the bridge of Dharma between worlds. Intrigued, the scholar dug deeper, found letters, edicts, diplomatic notes in her hand, a scattered but unmistakable trail. He published a book. It was not popular, but another scholar read it, and another. Decades passed. The world changed, and in time the truth emerged, that Chabi Khatun had not merely been a wife, or a patroness, or a consort. She had been the architect of the Yuan soul. Not its borders, not its battles, the soul. In modern museums, you can find her name now, not always front and center but present, in corners of exhibits on imperial China, in timelines of Mongol expansion, in academic conferences where historians argue about soft power centuries before the term existed. But her greatest legacy is not in glass cases or lecture halls. It is in the idea, still radical, that empire can be more than domination, that strength can come from restraint, that a woman, born on the edge of the world, can become the center of it not by conquering but by connecting, and that when the dust of history settles, when the banners fall and the names are forgotten, what remains is not power, but balance.